So, if you ever thought the MCU hasn't done a great job of explaining the connections or differences between things like He Who Remains, the TVA, Kang, Kang Variants, variants in general, the Sacred Timeline, time travel, the quantum realm, the multiverse, and how mutants and X Men will fit into all of this, then you're in the right place. John and I are about to go into this in great detail for the next hour, but if you want the quick and dirty version of it, it starts with Loki Season 1 and the He Who Remains Kang variants. He creates and manages the sacred timeline in the TVA. The TVA then prunes any timelines that occur throughout the multiverse that deviate from the predefined sacred timeline, but pruning isn't random. The He Who Remains Kang variant and the TVA have been pruning all of these branched or variant timelines in order to prevent the Council of Kangs from forming, thus preventing the events we're going to see play out in Ant-Man Quantumania, Loki Season 2, Avengers Kang Dynasty, and then culminating in Avengers Secret Wars with a DC Infinite Crisis style event. But how do mutants and X-Men fit into this? Remember, time is not linear, so at one point there was no sacred timeline, meaning there was no pruning, and an infinite number of Kang variants were all throughout the multiverse. Most importantly, one Kang variant known as the ancient Egyptian Rama-Tut, who would then go on to create the first mutant, aka Apocalypse. Apocalypse would then go on to introduce mutation into all of humanity, thus creating mutants and the X-Men. Meaning, our MCU 616 timeline did have mutants, but we've been seeing the MCU 616 timeline play out in a multiverse where He Who Remains has put the TVA and the sacred timeline in place to prune all the branch timelines with Kang variants. So everything we've seen happen in the MCU with no mutants is a result of the He Who Remains variant that we saw in Loki Season 1, pruning Rama-Tut from the MCU's 616 timeline. So no Rama-Tut, no Apocalypse, no mutants, no X-Men. So if you are indeed interested in how we connected all these dots and, with all the evidence that we've found to support this within the MCU that kind of supports these theories and these claims, then Earth 1 Rob and Earth 1 John are about to get into that here, so enjoy that. And also, if any of you guys are familiar with the new rock stars or Eric Voss or EA Voss, for one, go check out their channel. They put out great content. But for two, Eric recently put up this video here called 10 Times Kang Changed the MCU Timeline in Phase 4, which ironically was pretty much what this video was initially going to be until I stumbled upon this theory. But in this video, he goes on to suggest that at least I don't know if he really meant it this way, but it came across that he thought that the MCU timeline itself, the MCU 616 timeline, was pretty much the only timeline that exists within the sacred timeline, but I don't believe that's the case. So Eric, if you see this, everyone share this to Eric, so I'd love for him to see this video and these theories. So imagine you have a computer sitting here, and the only thing you have on this computer, the only thing it does is it plays every movie and TV show in the Marvel Cinematic Universe in chronological order, and it's just on repeat. It's looping just forever and ever and ever. It never stops playing. Now, imagine that as a timeline, okay, as it exists in the MCU. So that computer is going to represent a timeline, and what it's doing, it's playing, just looping through every movie and everything we've seen in the MCU up until this point. Now imagine you have a second computer that's doing the exact same thing. It's just looping the MCU movies and TV shows on repeat. Now the only difference between these two computers is that they're not playing the same movie or scene at the same time. So on computer 1, you have just the first Avengers movies playing on computer 1, and then the Thor 4, so Thor Love and Thunder is playing on the second computer. So you have timeline 1, computer 1, and timeline 2, computer 2. One's on Avengers, one's on Thor 4. But if you take a step back and look at the monitors, you're able to see both of those movies at the exact same time. So each moment in time is repeating itself, and they exist at the same time, like everything ever all at once, like quite literally. So now just imagine you have 100 of these computers. They're all playing through the MCU, but you take a step back and you're able to see all 100 of these different computer screens, and they're all taking place during different times in the MCU. So all of these computer screens you're seeing are timelines. It's 100 different timelines. It's all in this situation just focusing on the things we've seen in the MCU, but they're all existing at the same exact time. That's like how essentially they were able to travel back to Avengers 1 to get the Infinity Stones in Endgame because there was a time. Like they're existing in this time frame in the movie, but then they're able to go back because it's there. You can. It's all there. That's essentially how the TVA sees time themselves. They're able to pretty much just take a step back. They exist outside reality, and that's how they can see all the different timelines, go back and prune whatever they want. Make sense? And that's kind of where the branches and pruning and variants come into play, because it's kind of like, look at the Matrix Reloaded when Neo is talking to the architect, and in that room, even, as they're talking, there's all those computer screens going, behind Neo in the background, and the architect's even explaining, like, in this situation to him, like, that they've done this before. Like, and you see all the other times this is played out, and then it comes to a point where Neo has to make a choice, right? He has to go save Trinity, or he has to stay there and do what he's quote unquote supposed to do with the architect. And so that singular part, you have two potential branches there essentially. So, and we saw the events play out in the film where Neo chose to go save Trinity. But there was another time where Neo chose to stay there and do his thing there. So there were two branches of a timeline that just formed right there essentially. And we just, like I said, we saw one of them play out, which by virtue is exactly what our Loki did in Endgame when our Avengers went back to the time period of the Avengers 1. They created an event there, an opportunity where Loki was able to do something that allowed him to deviate from the initial timeline, and he picked up the Tesseract, and then we got the Loki season 1 show. Eventually, someone can make a choice that deviates from that timeline, and in this instance, Kang would be pruning them. The He Who Remains variant has been pruning a lot of them just to maintain essentially order in the multiverse. So we go on to expand on this a lot more in this video, but the thought behind it is he's pruning every variant or branch timeline that pops up that could potentially lead to one of the Kang variants going on to conquer that timeline. So he is, by virtue of creating this sacred timeline, he is in some ways protecting the multiverse from the Council of Kangs and preventing the events that we're going to see play out in the Kang Dynasty and in Secret Wars. So if you were ever curious about how the X-Men are going to fit into all this and how we could potentially see all of the events of the MCU play out, but actually include the X-Men as if they have been there the entire time and make it fit in narratively, then you're going to want to watch the rest of this video because we break it down, and it's honestly, I was shocked that it worked so well that like we went on about it for as long as we did and just thought of all the infinite possibilities and all the cool stuff that Kevin Feige could do if they actually do introduce these elements into the MCU. It would just be great. It was really fun to talk about, so I hope you guys like it. Take it away, Rob. All right, so I originally was going to make an editorial-esque video about how Kang may have influenced some of the events of the MCU, and we just don't really know it yet. And one of the things I thought, for instance, was like maybe the 10 rings that Shang-Chi uses, maybe in a variant of Kang at one point from the future died and left those here on Earth, that kind of thing. And then maybe even the bangle from Miss Marvel. We saw in the show that Aisha, I think her name was, the grandmother, when she, in that flashback scene, pulled the bangle off the corpse, it was a blue corpse. So everyone immediately assumed it was like a Kree corpse. But it very well could have been a Kang corpse. Little things like that. I started like cross-referencing all these things that could potentially have been a variant of Kang that left these things behind, since, inevitably the announcement of Kang Dynasty being the next Avengers film, and then that going into Secret Wars, definitely made me think that Kang is going to be playing a much larger role in the overall events of the MCU than maybe we thought of before. I think, at least for me, I never thought Kang wasn't going to be like a Thanos level villain, and as I started connecting some of these dots, I very well think that may be possible, and because of the time travel that is innately involved with Kang, there could be some interesting ways that they could actually do that, and eventually, I stumbled upon this theory where they could do all these things, introduce Kang and like put him into events that have already occurred, made him be the catalyst for a lot of these things we've already seen. And there's also a way to even have mutants tied into that or tied into a Kang variant in particular. And I broke down this entire theory. I have like a 3-page essay that I wrote about this. I crossed a lot of T's, dotted a lot of I's. And like this was me like all day. You insert me into the Pepe Sylvia meme. That was me. And I got this. And when I first discovered all of this, like I said, I was just going to make an editorial video and just talk about it. But then I thought I would really like to see somebody actually have like kind of like check me, tell me if I'm too crazy, tell me if this doesn't make any sense. So that's why I have John here with me. So John's I'm gonna float these ideas to you. All right, I'll give you the bullet points of all of this stuff because it really is like if you have one. I'm gonna get my I have a tinfoil hat here, and if you have one, this is the good time to use it. All right.
Okay, I did not come prepared, but yeah.
If you can read it, I don't know if you can. It says Marvel shill because I'm doing a Marvel video, so obviously I'm getting paid by them, right? But this is why, if you have a tinfoil hat, now's the time to put it on. Okay. But first, before we get into it, what have been your thoughts? Because I know like a lot of people have complained about the MCU in Phase 4 and 5, for instance. Well, not so much 5 yet, but nevertheless, it's been sort of directionless. We don't really know what's going on. And I honestly, I think it's kind of an unfair statement in some ways because there is really nothing like the MCU that is this big soap opera of interconnectivity. So no one's really getting bent out of shape when they see like a James Bond movie. And then there's 10 years in between a James Bond movie, like the most recent one. They really did go like 5, 6, 7+ years or something. But no one was all bent out of shape about, well, where's it going? Like, where is it going? What does it all mean? And I get it because, it's the MCU and we're kind of conditioned to do that now. I really wasn't going to leave this on the whole time, but just, if you do have one, it's a good time to put it on. But nevertheless, have you felt that it's been directionless? Like, are you confused about where everything's going? I remember when Loki came out, we were doing reviews of that. I remember we kind of talked about it was kind of confusing because we had multiverse stuff and then we had the sacred timeline and all these things. Interestingly enough, I tie all that stuff together in this cockamamie theory. But what have been your thoughts about everything? And do you think Kang is going to be a big role in this or whatever? And then I can get into some of this theory stuff I came up with.
Yeah, I mean, as far as Kang goes, I definitely think that he's not the Thanos level. Like Thanos was like gonna tear everything down and like he could literally possibly destroy the whole MCU. I think Kang can rewrite the whole MCU. I don't think he's not the physical wipe everybody out threat that maybe Thanos was, but he's definitely the alter reality threat. So it's a different type of threat, but I do think he's for go back to Buffy the Vampire Slayer days, the big bad of this era or this phase of the MCU. As far as Phase 4 goes, I've been hearing the same things you have. That people are like, "Oh, what's it doing? Where are they going?" Like, I don't understand how any of this connects and stuff. And I think that's kind of an inevitable response when you have such a tightly woven story like the Infinity Saga was, where everything just builds and builds and builds, and then you get Infinity War, and then you get Endgame on top of that, and you need a calm. This is one of the things as a lifelong comic book reader. This is one of the things that absolutely drives me nuts about comic books is when they try and do event on top of event on top of event. Like eventually, the events just become the standard, the status quo, and then nothing feels special anymore. That's why I really liked what Kevin Feige said about the Avengers movies. Like we're going to save them to cap these phases or these eras, because if you're just doing them all the time, then it's just they don't stand out. Nothing becomes special anymore. When you have comic book publishers doing event series every 2 months. It's like, okay, great. DC has that problem right now. DC has done so many crisis events in the past decade that I'm getting off topic. I know we're doing here for Marvel, but DC has done so many crisis level events. Like they've got a new crisis level event going on right now. And it's kind of like, okay, but yeah, we just got out of an alternate, or reality warping, rewriting event like at the end of 2020 or 2021. I can't even remember when death metal happened, but it never seems to end. And so I'm fine with Phase 4 being more low key. Like this is the okay, take your breath, give me good superhero stories, give me good stuff that like I, I've I've enjoyed. I know people have their issues with some of the stuff, but I love Shang-Chi. Eternals
Right.
was hit or miss.
I like that more than most,
Probably
I think.
yeah, yeah. It may have not have been as, but again, you have to kind of reset your expectations. Like, was Eternals a Civil War level Captain America Civil War type movie? No, but it also wasn't meant to be. It's establishing a different corner of the universe. So anyway, I'm getting really long winded. I'm taking up all of our tinfoil time. But I was just no, I like where he's going with it. I feel it's very important that you have these things where not everything is earth shattering, not everything is end of the world, like universe altering. I think they're doing the groundwork right now with series like Loki and with Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness and stuff. And hopefully all these things will slowly build on each other. And then by the time we get to Kang, and by the time you lay out the blueprint here, we'll have it'll be worth all that. It will mean more at the end because we have gone through these building stages. So that's my
Right.
thoughts.
No, no, all that makes sense and that's fair. And it's kind of I was bringing it up to you a little bit before, but I didn't want to get too much into it. And like, would you say it's at least fair to say that the Infinity Saga? I think it kind of goes into kind of what we were talking about, where people are just kind of it seems directionless right now. But I think part of that is because, like you kind of alluded to, that Infinity War was just very laid out. Just it was beat by beat. You had a post credit scene to set up this, that, and the other, and it was all very transparent. Whereas nothing in Phase 4 has really been transparent about that overall picture. And I would go as far as to say that it's very possible that it has been, but we just don't know it yet. Because with Kang and all the time travel stuff, they could very easily, like I imagine a scene in this kind of goes into like the theory crafting bit, and but nevertheless, I imagine like Quantumania is going to be the first big thing we see, like Kang and what his influence really could be, or and just are. We're going to learn
Mhm.
most of what we're gonna learn of Kang in general is gonna happen, in my opinion, probably. Who knows though? Because a lot of Phase 6 is still pretty much wide open up until the Kang Dynasty occurs. But it's gonna be Quantumania and Loki season 2. And I don't really think anything else is probably gonna touch on Kang himself, probably much, because he hasn't yet to this date, right? We got introduced to a variant of Kang in He Who Remains in Loki season 1, and that is ironically where all of this theory of mine starts, by the way. It literally starts with this guy. This is the key to this entire theory here. And I remember when we were talking about Loki, this the sacred timeline and everything. I remember like I don't know if you might feel differently about it now, but I remember you being kind of confused about the sacred timeline stuff and just where they were going with it, and like I kind of was too. Like I'm not like saying that you just didn't kid it, John, by any means. I'm not saying that at all, but like we didn't know what it meant in comparison to like, well, what's the multiverse have to do with this? What's Spider-Man have to do with this? And then Kevin Feige had a comment at one point that the events of Loki. This is what really sparked me connecting these dots, by the way, is this one comment from Kevin Feige leading up into Spider-Man No Way Home. He said that the events of Loki really opened up the door for what's to come in like WandaVision and Spider-Man No Way Home. So he was essentially saying that like that was like the catalyst of it all, right? That is why obviously I think that this guy is very important here, and like this is where it all begins, right? So I'll lay down. Oh, one thing too, but tying to your point too, before I forget. to your point about like everything being big crossovers, not really can't be that. Marvel's kind of running into a problem with that right now because like you see it in the She-Hulk trailer. There's just superpowered people everywhere. So like you no longer have when you have all these big events and everyone just wants these big events. The fantastical is just mundane now.
Yeah.
Like before, Spider-Man was like cool. Like it's like there's no one like Spider-Man. Now there's a million people like Spider-Man. Now there's a million people like Captain America. And then if you always have these big event things and like nothing feels like special anymore. And I think that's why Miss Marvel was really good. I love Miss Marvel. I
Yeah.
thought that was perfect. It was really good. But not to get into a bunch of Miss Marvel, because really, Miss Marvel doesn't mean much in this, even though they dropped the mutant thing at the end of Miss Marvel, irrelevant to this, that doesn't matter. Like, I don't think that's gonna come into play for a while. Because not to go off the rails, but just because they dropped the word mutant and the showrunner even said that like Kevin Feige wanted them to do that, but they don't know. She explicitly said she doesn't know what Kevin Feige's doing with that. They just
Yeah.
wanted her to drop that in there and say that and imply that she's a mutant. Could very well mean just later on down the line that mutation was just a fill-in word and she's actually an inhuman and the bangle maybe activated her X gene and they could make Inhumans be really the same thing, but like some can go through Terrigenesis to force the mutation, and others just evolve into it naturally.
Yeah.
So she could still be an Inhuman, but nevertheless, let me get into these bullet points. I'm gonna break down some bullet points here about this big old theory.
All right, let's do
You,
it.
feel free to ask questions, but
Okay.
I got the bullet points that's just gonna run down everything as to how we get from point A to point B.
Okay.
Anything you have a question about, I have the answers in my big 3-page document here. So
Okay.
I'll go over the bullet points and then we can go back after the bullet points and further explain as to who, what, when, where, and why. And then I'll just, we might just touch on it since you're here just asking questions anyway. So the first thing, though, I feel like, do you think I should pull up a Word doc and write all these down? Like, maybe I will, maybe I won't.
I don't know.
But the first one here is, like I said, He Who Remains is where this all starts. All right. Bullet point number one. The thing and we never really got a major idea of, I feel like he kind of alluded to it when he was talking to Loki and Sylvie at the end. He alludes to the fact that he's very cognizantly aware of all the other variants. He said that at some point in time, his variants, the other Kangs, and like he had that little clay model thing start fighting, and there's all the Kangs fighting each other. So like he's astutely aware of how dangerous all the Kangs are, all his variants are. So he creates the TVA. And what we know based on the show, all we were really told was that the TVA is there to prune variants as they occur and deviate from the sacred timeline. Right? That's what we know. Okay? So, with that, what we never really got the answer to is well, why? Like, why did He Who Remains himself? Why did he create the sacred timeline? What was he actually doing? Like, what was so special about the sacred timeline? What was the problem if it just, goes away like it does at the end of the show when Loki and Sylvie kill her, or kill him rather? Yeah, we know that it's just going to create, like, now all these variant well, not really variant, but all these other universes are going to branch off. All these other timelines or universes, whatever you want to call them, it's really interchangeable at this point. Because that was one of the things we always talked about with Loki is like, what's the difference between a multiverse and then a timeline that's created by a variant? Like, are they the same thing? And yes, they would be one and the same here in this instance. Because there's really another way to look at it. Like, time isn't a linear thing. So, like, Kang went and created the sacred timeline and started pruning out all these different variant universes and variant timelines that popped up. But because time's not a linear thing, at one point in time, all those universes and timelines that were being pruned by the TVA, they once existed. Right? Like, period, blanket statement. They had to have existed at some point in time in order for the TVA to be able to go and prune it because it didn't fit in with what the sacred timeline was constructed to be. So when you start thinking about it that way, my thought here is that the He Who Remains Kang variant that we met in Loki created the sacred timeline explicitly to prune all of these other timelines where a Kang variant would have become a conqueror of said timeline. So it wasn't just because this Loki did something he wasn't supposed to do and now we're going to prune him. It's because that one point is just what we saw, right? In that timeline, potentially there would have been a Kang variant who would have achieved a bit too much power and caused a little bit too much chaos to inevitably lead to what we're going to see in the Kang Dynasty film. So, the sacred timeline was essentially constructed by a version of Kang, a variant of Kang, the He Who Remains that we met, in order to keep all other Kangs from becoming conquerors and creating the Council of Kangs. Thus, we will see the events of that, the ramifications of the sacred timeline being destroyed now, literally in the Kang Dynasty film. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, yeah, he's trying to consolidate power just for himself and
Well,
not.
no, he was trying to remove Kangs. He created the sacred timeline explicitly to ensure that the Council of Kangs did not exist. The only
Okay.
way for the other, because that's the thing, as soon as he gets killed by Sylvie at the end, and Loki goes back to the timeline, there's a
Mhm.
statue of Kang the Conqueror.
Yes.
It wasn't there when he was maintaining the sacred timeline.
Okay.
So immediately after the sacred timeline is destroyed, boom, a Kang variant has conquered that timeline immediately.
Sure.
So
Okay.
that's physical evidence as to like what he was doing with the sacred timeline. Just literally keeping Kangs at bay. And he alluded to that with showing the little clay model of the Kangs fighting,
Mhm.
right? That's the thing. He never outright said this is what and why he was doing this. And the thing is, Loki and Sylvie never even directly asked him. That was the most annoying thing. Like, at no point when they had the little convo did they just say, well, like, why are you doing this though? Like, they never explicitly asked. We never get the answer. But I'm telling you, when I'm done with this, it works so well. I know I made up the theory, but like, it works so well. I'd be hard pressed to like say that this just isn't it, because enough more evidence we have of explicitly Kang timelines being wiped out, Kang variant timelines being pruned explicitly by the TVA, created by He Who Remains. You literally see it when Loki gets pruned himself and he goes to that void land where Alioth is, right?
Yep.
If you remember, there were a bunch of Easter egg type things scattered about in there that had been the only way things get there, remember, is if they were pruned. But then if you look around, there's all these little Easter eggs directly ripped from the comics of like the Sphinx, and then the sign on one of the Avengers towers were there, and it had one of Kang's aliases last names on it from a Kang timeline. There were all these little Easter eggs that were directly ripped from the Kang Dynasty comic of the Council of Kangs, and where like Kang Prime had his little utopia that had all these things he collected from all these different timelines. We saw a bunch of those things when Loki got pruned. They were all there. So that's even more evidence that the timelines that were being pruned had Kangs in them, because all that shit was there. Like, it would just have to be. So yeah, it could have just been Easter eggs, but again, this plays back into the theory of like there are all of these things that like, it seems directionless right now. But once these pieces are put in play and you like look at it from this perspective, like everything's there. We just haven't been told it's there, right?
Right.
So one of the things I told you though too was, because it doesn't end here, ladies and gentlemen. I said that if we follow along these bullet points here, if you go by this theory that essentially is built upon the Kang variant, He Who Remains, creating the sacred timeline explicitly to prune out all the variant timelines to allow Kang not to exist, right? No Council of Kangs, no Kang Dynasty, done. all those other explanations, all the evidence to support it, and I think the biggest evidence to support that this is true is the fact that we have a Kang Dynasty movie coming around the corner, and it's an Avengers movie, so it's obviously going to be a big deal. But I made a video that was about the X-Men, and this is I think the most important part and why I think this works so well. But I made a video about the X-Men, and it was saying, can the MCU even bring in the X-Men without compromising all of the history and lore that comes with them? And I'm not going to get into the whole thing, but like the main thing is, like, obviously you don't have if you were to introduce mutants right now, like bada bing bada boom, say the snap gave mutation throughout humanity, whatever it may be, you lose out on all the lore about like it being a mutation and the next step in human evolution, and you lose the Homo superior rising and Homo sapiens not liking Homo superior because, I mean, they're superior, so you lose out on all the socio-political dynamics of the X-Men. And if you don't really have that, a lot of things don't really start to work as well. Like Magneto's entire character is built upon his hatred towards humans because he's seen how vile they have been, and like obviously you kind of lose out on his story about being alive in World War II era because he'd be like 100 at this point. So a lot of it doesn't really work. But with this, by the end of it, there is a way to make this all work. Now, granted, it obviously is timeline stuff, but I think at the end of it all, with Secret Wars, this will all culminate and everything will kind of merge into one. So, let's move down the list, all right? So we know now with no more Sacred Timeline, the Kang variants are going to be running wild in the universe. That's going to lead to Kang Dynasty, obviously. So, that is why He Who Remains created the timeline, just to keep all the Kangs away to prevent that from happening, right? Now, time isn't linear, okay? So follow me here. Since time is not linear, like I said before, all of these timelines that have been pruned because of the Sacred Timeline, because of eventually the He Who Remains variant of Kang, he had to grow up and exist. He had to grow up and actually do this at some point. So, obviously, before the Sacred Timeline, all of this stuff was happening without being pruned. So this is where the X-Men stuff and the mutant stuff comes into play. And there's evidence of this. In Moon Knight, one of the Kang variants is the ancient Egyptian Rama-Tut. Okay? In Moon Knight, the little thug that Oscar Isaac was chasing on a rooftop, he had like a jean denim jacket on or something, and there was an image of Rama-Tut on it. And the producer confirmed it was Rama-Tut. And he said that they knew it was there. It was purposely put there. So they explicitly put Rama-Tut there, who is a Kang variant. So, because of all the timelines being pruned, Rama-Tut didn't exist anymore. His timeline kept getting pruned away to make the Sacred Timeline flow and to keep the Council of Kangs from existing. So, prior to the Sacred Timeline being formed, Rama-Tut would have existed just like anyone else did. Now, because Rama-Tut existed, now you have to bear in mind here, this is what I think the MCU is going to do. It's not obviously a one-to-one. The MCU is never a one-to-one adaptation of the comics, right? So, but if they do this, it ties in perfectly and makes narrative sense with everything that the MCU has already established. So, now Rama-Tut is not being pruned. That would allow Rama-Tut to create Apocalypse, the first mutant. So during the timelines when Rama-Tut wasn't getting pruned, he was able to create mutation. He created the first mutants, Apocalypse, during, him, Kang smart guy. He's just doing a lot of tests on people, trying to make a superior race. Who knows what he's doing? But we have the Kang variant Rama-Tut in ancient Egypt make Apocalypse. Then later, we know the whole story, really. Apocalypse goes on to spread mutation throughout all of humanity. So now we have X-Men. And they would have existed in a normal timeline because this is all taking place, during any time period you want. You could have Magneto grow up in World War II and go through everything that he went through in the comics in this way. Because all of this has happened at the same time that we've seen our MCU But the MCU that we've seen has been essentially a variant branch of MCU Earth 616 because He Who Remains was pruning Rama-Tut from our world. So that's why we have seen the MCU play out as it has with no mutants, no X-Men, no mention of it until the sacred timeline is broken with Miss Marvel, mind you. But that's why. Because they've been being pruned this whole time. So we've been essentially watching the universe play out as if mutants weren't there. And they weren't because they were being pruned. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yep.
Okay. So again, that's the whole MCU timeline is legit, and the mutants should have been here the whole time, but they've been pruned from existence because Rama-Tut was never there to be able to create Apocalypse and later create mutants and yada yada yada. So I think what we're going to eventually see is essentially all that play out in either Kang Dynasty or primarily Secret Wars, because I think going back to what I said before, where like the bangle and the 10 rings could have been weapons left by variants of Kang from different timelines. It's still possible in this situation because I think what we might see in like the 10 rings, for instance, make a ton of sense because in the post-credit scene, you had Wong sitting there. He's like, "Oh, ancient texts say nothing." Bruce Banner's got absolutely zero scientific reading on it at all. Carol Danvers and her space police knowledge is like, "Puh, it ain't Kree. I've never seen anything like it." So if it's not Kree, it's not an ancient text, not whatever. Well, it would pretty much make sense for it to be from the future then, because it doesn't exist, and that's why no one has any readings on it. So it obviously could have been a weapon of a variant of Kang at some point. So, like, we might see in Secret Wars or Kang Dynasty, like, when, we confront the Council of Kangs, we could very well see a variant of Kang wielding a version of the Ten Rings and fighting Shang-Chi and stuff. We could eventually see the bangle may very well be, one half of the negabands at some point, and it's just that was something that a variant of Kang created or was using at one point, and then he died here at some point in time. Who the hell knows? But like all that stuff could easily tie in, right?
Yep.
So what are your thoughts on this so far? Have I lost you? That's pretty much the bullet by bullet, like He Who Remains creates timeline to prevent the Council of Kangs from existing. Now this timeline's broken, so Council of Kangs are out. One of the variant Kangs was Rama-Tut. Rama-Tut created mutants, so mutants would be here, but He Who Remains have been pruning them the whole time. So that's why there's no mutants.
Yeah.
Essentially makes sense.
So, and that's like, so there was before the sacred timeline was established, and that's where this is where time travel and multiverses become,
Yep.
is ubiquitous the right word? Like yeah.
That's why they become confusing, monotonous, and they contradict themselves a lot.
Yeah. So like pre the pruning, pre He Who Remains starting to prune things to prevent um the Council of Kangs and other Kangs from taking power, there would be a timeline where there would be a branch where mutants existed. There might be multiple branches with multiple mutant, it plays out differently each time.
Yeah, and we know that to be true because of Multiverse of Madness. There was a Reed Richards there. There was a Charles Xavier there. So mutants were able to exist in other multiverses or other timelines, no problem. Sure. But on our MCU 616 timeline that we've been seeing since Iron Man 1, we're looking at that version under the lens of a microscope of Kang, He Who Remains, had been pruning Rama-Tut. So everything we've watched has essentially been a branch off of the sacred timeline, like, of our universe.
Is everything we've watched so far up until the end of Loki season 1, is everything that we watched up until that point the Sacred Timeline, or is the
Yeah.
Sacred Timeline okay? So Iron Man 1 through end of Loki season 1, Sacred Timeline.
Yep. At
He who
minimum,
remains, he who okay,
because that's
okay,
where there were no mutants.
sure,
So the
sure.
thing is, and this is where the time travel stuff and MCU's already contradicted themselves with multiverse and time travel stuff with Old Man Cap. Old Man Cap, based on the rules they established in Endgame, should not have been waiting on that bench as an old man. They made it very clear that when you go back in time, you don't affect your current reality. You're going back in time and you're creating a branch reality, which is in line with the sacred timeline stuff. That's variance. That actually goes in line. But because they had Old Man Cap still be in their plane of existence, essentially, in their timeline as an old man, he couldn't have been there unless he time traveled back. And the writers even said that they contradicted themselves there and they just wanted to have that ending. So you can kind of take that as you will. So like they knew they contradicted themselves, but they wanted the ending. So, but
Yeah, unless that old man Cap played out his life in a variant timeline and figure out how to get back to the regular MCU timeline to be, I say regular, but whatever our
yeah, our
MCU
timeline. Yeah.
proper timeline is.
Right.
Um, that would be a way to get around that. Okay, so yeah, so mutants don't exist. Okay, so here's I think the another question that would be I would have would be if Loki and Sylvie taken out He Who Remains at the end of Loki season 1 has those immediate ramifications because then He Who Remains is no longer TVA is no longer there to prune the timeline, and it has the immediate ramifications of Loki goes back to the TVA and there's a statue of Kang the Conqueror there. Where are the mutant ramifications? Where if the timeline where mutants exist has been restored, where is the mutant hatred? Where is the average Joe's fear of mutants?
Right.
And
Well,
why
that's
isn't
the
it being
problem.
shown?
Yeah. That's the innate problem because the way they would have to make this work is that they would have to have this be there's a couple ways, but based on evidence we've actually seen in the movies, which is what I'm basing this shit off of, so that
Mhm.
it at least is coherent. So I'm operating on some form of rules that they've established. That's why it's not completely tinfoil stuff. It's just theory crafting based on what I've seen. But
Sure.
there's two things they could do here. So they had, you know, after Loki season 1, like you said, he goes back, Kang's there. So we're seeing some sort of immediate ramifications of a timeline being like immediately affected, right? So one thing they could explain that off by is that when he went back, it wasn't actually the same timeline. Like
Hmm.
now that there's a bunch of different timelines, he tried to jump to the one that he was supposed to, but they're going all over the place now. So maybe it was a different one. Another reason they could explain that is from what Mr. Fantastic said in Doctor Strange, the incursion stuff. And this is how they could kind of explain how mutants would be able to come in and still have all of their lore and history that comes along with it, is that eventually the incursion happens, and we saw and in Doctor Strange the bad side of the incursion, right, with the Sinister Strange world, but we never saw the other world that didn't get destroyed. So perhaps when those timelines collide to create the incursion, one side ends up being real shitty, but the other side just takes essentially all the other stuff and it gets there and it's fine, whatever. They could explain it that way if they wanted. Who knows? But one thing they could do, this is where I think they would go with it, is would make the most sense. So it's not an immediate thing that you see, like because of the sacred timeline rupturing. It's a slow and gradual thing. Like all these timelines are going and crazy and whatever, and then eventually the problem with it is that you just run the risk of incursion type events happening. So maybe along the way, through phase 5, and as we get into phase 6 and we get into the Kang Dynasty and everything, maybe like my guess is that they will use Secret Wars to cut this multiverse timeline stuff off and have an infinite crisis type of event where everything at the end of Secret Wars is back to one.
Okay.
So, and that's essentially like maybe they find out that, like I said, all these timelines are just because he remains is no longer there to prevent all this shit from happening. Like, yeah, they lost a lot of stuff along the way, like mutants never existed in the 616 because of the timeline, but the timeline was preventing the Kang dynasty to happen and the Council of Kangs to meet up, and it was keeping these timelines in check from collapsing and colliding into each other to create these incursions, which just destroy universes left and right, kind of thing.
Mhm.
So maybe we eventually see that, damn, the sacred timeline was kind of important. We kind of need that. And like maybe that's where Secret Wars kind of culminates, right? And like they're able to reset that. So one of the things that I think they could then do with the mutants to introduce all of their history and lore into the events of the MCU in a visually pleasing way, in a natural way, and then be able to actually go back and tell the stories again would just be to have that happen, have Secret Wars somehow be the catalyst that, they have to explain it better, but it all merges the universes back and they reset to the way things were supposed to be pre-pruning essentially. So like I mentioned, you could see like in the Kang Dynasty movie or Quantumania, these variants of Kang using weapons like the Ten Rings against them, and it's like, oh, so now we know that that's there, whatever. In Secret Wars or the Kang Dynasty, we could see events of the MCU play out as they did with the mutants pre-pruning, so they could show the Battle of New York, but like Wolverine's there and Cyclops is
Mhm.
there, and they just like CG him in, and like they visually show us that like our universe did exist as this with mutants. They were there during the Battle of New York, fighting alongside the Avengers. They were there in Endgame. You could see them coming through the portals. They could easily just have scenes just explaining and showing like exactly the ramifications of Kang existing because of the Council of Kangs, they're going through all this fucking chaos in the Kang Dynasty movie. But then you also see the flip side of that, like, well, because he was pruning everything, this entire race of people, the mutants, just were completely blipped from our world. Like it was no different than Thanos, right? So
Yeah.
that's why, like, somehow they all try to work together to reset things in a more natural way, and that's where you can introduce the mutants and have them just meld directly back into the MCU. So when we start watching MCU movies in present day, we just know that mutants have been there the whole time now because it was explained that they were there. And if they did that, the cool thing they could do is Kevin Feige could go back and tell like the origin story he wants for them and set it in that original timeline before they were pruned. So they could
Yeah.
tell this entirely disconnected like origin for all of them coming through like I said, Magneto could still be growing up through World War II in this time if he wanted to. Like he could do all of that because when this actually happened, it was before everything we saw. Because
Mhm.
what we saw in the MCU 616 was essentially a variant timeline. But now all this stuff happened and they can just show it. And then bada bing, bada boom, they can just, because of whatever happens in Secret Wars, now they're all just here with everybody. You know
Mhm.
what I mean? It's almost like I said in the X-Men video, like at this point, I really would like I wouldn't even care if Kevin Feige just made a press conference and just said, like, look, guys, we got mutants now. They're here. I'm not gonna introduce it. It's too hard. Like we
Yeah.
can't do it without breaking canon. Like if we introduce them now, then we lose all the socio-political stuff that comes along with them. Hell, we already lost the fact that Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver aren't Magneto's daughter. They're not his kids right now. So it's just going to be a lot easier if we just start telling stories with the mutants as if they've always been here. So that's what we're going to do.
Yeah.
Peace. Like, and I'd be cool with that. Like, who cares? I would honestly think it's better than like I don't know, kind of like the Batgirl situation. It's like I would love to see a Batgirl movie, but I don't want the Batgirl movie to suck. So if it sucks, just don't release it. So it's
Yeah.
like I don't want Kevin Feige to compromise all the stuff that makes X-Men great, just so they can have this nice, neat story of this overarching story, like, just,
Yeah.
whatever. But with this theory, they could make it work.
Sure.
Like, there obviously are some stuff you have to explain in a good, nice, non-confusing way, but that's a really easy thing to do with a good visual storyteller. Because that's
Mhm.
where having, like, just a quick scene of where someone is explaining that Rama-Tut created Apocalypse, he created mutants, and then, all this happened before the Sacred Timeline, and because we pruned him, none of these people existed, and, like, they're all there because of Secret Wars, right? So, like, all these X-Men characters show up, and our MCU people are like, "Well, what the hell is this?" Like, it would've been nice to have you back in, New York, and then they could show a scene with the X-Men there in New York, and, like, that's where we all learned that, like, "Oh, shit. They were there the whole time. We
Yeah.
just didn't get to see it." And then
So yeah,
by the end of it all, they're just there, you
yeah.
know? Like,
This sounds. I mean, it sounds very similar to a lot of ways to what DC has done post Infinite Crisis or Crisis on Infinite Earths back in the 80s. Crisis, for those that are younger or not as well versed in the world of comics, Crisis on Infinite Earths was DC Comics' attempt back in the 80s to streamline their universe and make it easier for new people to come in, because at that point the comic books had a literal infinite number of universes. So anything that a comic book creator wanted to do, if it didn't fit within regular canon, they just said, "Oh, it happened in an alternate universe." And then, in order to kind of make comics simpler for people to come into and read, they got rid of all of the infinite universes with the exception of one, and they left only the proper DC comic book. And it's one of the most well known. It's one of the most popular. It's in a lot of ways the very first giant crossover event comic book that was ever published. Um, and then DC in subsequent years has realized that they may have been jumping the gun to make it that simplistic, and may have lost some of what made DC in a way unique, and a lot of characters that people really cared about and loved, and they've since kind of undid to a certain extent a lot of what happened in Crisis on Infinite Earths. So this would be it is if this is what Marvel's doing, it very well could be. I mean, it all makes sense to me as far as you laid it out. Um, it is incredibly ironic and almost I can't even come up with the right words, but it's something that the literal Marvel Secret Wars movie, which is named after a comic series that was only came about because Marvel was trying to compete with Crisis on Infinite Earths, is basically doing what Crisis on Infinite Earths did, only in reverse. Like there's a whole bunch of levels to that whole scenario, if that's what's going on.
which is
That's very
exactly
cool.
Kevin Feige he would absolutely do that.
Yeah,
Like, I could
yeah,
totally see him doing it, and, like, literally, that's why I'm not kidding, that's why I went on my way to make this tinfoil hat, because, like, I'm glad that you at least makes sense to you and I was able to explain it well, because, like, in my head, it's like this very crystal clear, easy thing.
yeah.
Because, like, I just started thinking about it was honestly kinda crazy how I came up with it because, like, ironically, I just made this X-Men video and was like, "Ah, I don't envy Kevin Feige for having to try to introduce mutants and all this shit," it's like, just do the press conference thing, say they're here. But then I started thinking about it, and I was like, I really just remembered that comment that Kevin Feige himself made about Loki being kind of the catalyst for all of this stuff to happen. And
Yeah.
when he came out in Comic-Con and said that he dubbed 4, 5, and 6, those phases, the multiverse saga, it all just clicked to me, like, pretty much right when I remembered that those 2 things. Loki was the catalyst, and he actually dubbed the whole thing the Multiverse Saga, and it literally culminates with Kang Dynasty and Secret Wars.
Mhm.
And as soon as I connected those dots, this entire triage of just MCU-based lore flooded my brain. I was like, dude, it's gotta be He Who Remains and the timeline, and, like, they're gonna say that he was doing that to prevent the Council of Kangs, to literally prevent the events that we are going to see unfold in the Kang Dynasty. It all connects that way. Like, and that makes Loki the catalyst. And then you can just have a ton of fun with Kang just popping up into timelines because time isn't linear. Like, that's what people have to kind of grasp that and realize that it might not make a lot of sense too. Because like it really won't. Like there's gonna be a lot of contradictions like all time travel is. But if you just kind of peel back your brain for a minute and just accept that time isn't just a straight line, it's it's a circle. And you can travel through it in any way you want, like that's how you bend space time. It's like the paper trick, right? You have the piece of paper, but then you draw the circle and then you just shove the pen through the hole, and that's the fabric of space time
Yeah.
in a mundane way. But you could literally just show that there is a version of our 616 that had mutants, but old boy He Who Remains pruned Rama-Tut. We didn't have Rama-Tut, there was no apocalypse. No apocalypse, no mutants. And that's what we've seen play out this whole time. And like it would be a great way for them to like I just feel like it's the most easy way that fits into the Loki sacred timeline, Kang, everything. And I think it'd be just so cool if they actually then went back and told these stories about how the X-Men were there the whole time. They could literally reshoot the first Avengers movie, but include the X-Men. Because now we have this new timeline. They could redo anything they wanted just to include new characters and throw them in the mix. Because we're technically seeing now a completely different chain of events. Everything would be impacted in a different way. So they could have a lot of fun with that. Like right now we're seeing Sharon Carter kind of be a bad guy in the Armor Wars show, like set up in Falcon Winter Soldier. Yeah, like if they go back and redo some of this stuff, like some of that crap could just never even happen. Like it could be a whole different person there. Red Skull might actually be a player in more of the MCU because they wanted Red Skull to come back, but Hugo Weaving just hated being in that makeup. So Kevin Feige was like, you don't have to. Like, whatever.
Yeah.
But we could just have this whole new event play out. We could see the Captain America, the first Avenger, and he looks over to his right, and Logan's there with him. He's in boot camp with him. Like you could just do all this stuff, and you could do a whole movie about it, or you could just, like I said, just show like this montage scene of explaining all this stuff, and you could literally just have it be He Who Remains explaining it all because he knows, like he's seen the timeline. He just explains. Someone finally asks him, "Why did you create the sacred timeline?" And then he just explains it, like just like I did. But we get to see all this stuff play out. Like I feel like it makes perfect sense, and that's why I told you I was like not just because I came up with it. I'm not just like tooting my own horn or anything. It's just like it works so well that I would be very hard pressed to think that they're not doing something like that. It doesn't have to be like word for word verbatim, but it just the fact that we saw like Kevin Feige literally had them put an image of Rama-Tut on some thug's t-shirt. You don't do that if you don't have something planned for Rama-Tut. Like Rama-Tut is a very specific we were in Egypt. I get that, but like they didn't have other Egyptian stuff like that was like that alluded to this big thing when we are going into Kang Dynasty. Like, you know what I mean? Like I just feel like it makes too much sense. Makes too much sense.
Yeah. Well, and we'll see if they announce anything else for Phase 6 beyond the Avengers movies anytime soon. But I think once we start seeing, I feel with Rama-Tut being such a major and Apocalypse being such a major factor in what you're talking about, they're going to have a hard time. That's the one thing. Like, it will be interesting if we can identify any projects either in Phase 5 or Phase 6 once Phase 6 gets more fleshed out that would be able to provide that backstory. Because I think with as much as they're intrinsically linked in all this, then I think you need to really have a fleshed out backstory and not just a 5 minute like, oh, by the way, these two guys did this and they're important. But you know what I'm saying?
Oh no, I do. And I just thought you just made me think of something that they could do. Like I initially said that I kind of know for a fact that we're gonna see it's obvious. It's not like insider information, but we're gonna see the most information of Kang and the involvement that Kang has had in the MCU timeline, obviously in Quantumania and Loki season 2, right? So they could easily explain a lot of this stuff, and there's an easy way for them to explain a lot of those little things with kind of like I said, with just like showing a scene with Loki and how the TVA functions. Because if you remember, him and Mobius literally, or Morbius rather, I was thinking of New Gods, but him and Morbius literally, Morbius just sounds so funny. It is Mobius, isn't it? Because Morbius is the vampire, or is it
Yeah.
Morbius too? Now I'm all
It's
confused because I'm
Mobius.
thinking the Mobius chair, and then there's Mobius, and then Morbius, whatever. But they
Yeah, it's
literally
Mobius.
okay. They were watching though the timeline of the events of Loki's life on a film reel in the TVA.
Mhm.
So at some point, Loki could easily be investigating how the TVA is functioning now because now this new guy Kang is here, and he could be going through tapes, and we could just see little images of stuff, and he could grab what we know to be. If you remember, his film reel said Loki 616, so he could grab another Loki 616 reel or just any 616 reel, and we could just see some of these events like I explained play out. But oh, who the fuck is that? Who's that? Who's that there with Thor with the claws? Like this didn't happen. And Loki could literally have this scene. And like that could be our first little tease of like things aren't what they seem to have been or what we thought they were in the 616. But it doesn't end there. If he was ballsy, like you said, that we still probably need a little bit more introduction for like Rama-Tut, if Rama-Tut's going to be that important. They could just low key before this all culminates and we find out everything in Kang Dynasty and Secret Wars. They could have a mutants movie with Rama-Tut and explain mutants and XMen and just
Sure.
explain it with Rama-Tut created Apocalypse and just we watched it all play out. And going into it, we have no idea that it's going to tie into all this stuff necessarily. He could just be making an X-Men movie and we learn it all then. Like, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, because
Yeah.
it wouldn't be as long as he knows like that's what he's trying to do, he could easily work that stuff in. Like, and even if it's in small little bits and pieces here and there, we could just be watching this period piece X-Men movie, and then at the end of it, we find out that this is taking place in our world. Like we find out this is a 616. So then everyone leaves the theater like, well, how was that the 616 if where have they been the whole time? And like we could literally watch this X-Men movie and it could play out as if they are there with the Avengers. Like they could have literally the Avengers cameoing in, and they could just not explain any of this during the whole movie. But then we find out at the end with like a Kang cameo or something, and like he kind of explains it all. You know what I mean? That would be ballsy and that would be cool. Because it'd be kind of like the whole the multiverse of madness scene when you see the Illuminati, right? We
Yeah.
knew the Illuminati was going to be there, but we didn't know it was like Earth 818. We didn't know why or how they were there. So they could make this whole X-Men movie and like literally have them fighting alongside the Avengers during the Battle of New York or something. And we could be watching this whole thing the whole time, like, sure, this is great, but we're all just like, how is this happening? And then at the end, you have a little post-credit scene with Loki talking to Kang, and just they're watching a film reel, just like, yeah, this is what happened before I was pruned, and you find out it was Rama-Tut. Like, and then it's just that's it. It's just move on to the next movie. And we just
Yeah.
learn little things more and more and more.
Yeah, that works. I was while you're looking at that, I would pull up phase 5 because I just wanted to glance at it real quick and see if there was anything on there that really struck me. The other thing your theory does is it works nicely to reintegrate the Netflix Marvel shows back into the MCU proper. Like Daredevil didn't appear in any of the MCU proper things. Even though there were the passing references to the Battle of New York and all that stuff,
Mhm.
Daredevil doesn't show up. You would think a hero like Daredevil and Luke Cage would show up in um, in game or Infinity War or
Or
somewhere along the
Spider-Man.
way, or Spider Man, yeah. Um, and they didn't, but you've got Born Again coming in Phase 5, so that would your explanation would be a good way of saying, well, maybe one of the things Daredevil got pruned, and so that's why he wasn't there when we got to those points. So
Yeah,
yeah, no,
and
of
if they
course,
go the incursion-esque route too, and again, this is where there's all these different layers, but they set themselves up for this. They introduced multiverse, they introduced sacred timeline, they introduced TVA. So I mean, it's their world and they have to play in it. So like they run the risk of it being confusing, but if they went the route of like now that all these timelines are there and they're kind of colliding back into themselves and integrating with other ones or integrating with the timeline as it was supposed to be. It could just be small little things like Miss Marvel shows up. She was always
yeah,
there. She was always supposed to be there, but now she shows back up and she's a mutant.
yeah,
Daredevil shows up now. Like, and if you remember, these things happen after Loki destroys the sacred timeline. So it
mhm.
fits that that was the catalyst of it all. So like Daredevil reintegrated back into the timeline. Miss Marvel reintegrated back into the timeline because sacred timeline's gone, so the events that led to their pruning no longer happened.
Here's the one, and again, this is not canonically necessarily along the same timeline. It's more just um a release date issue with that is, in order for that to be the case, I think then you have to move Loki season 1 canonically before WandaVision, right? Because doesn't Wanda access the multiverse at the end of WandaVision? So if Loki destroying He Who Remains and setting off the branch realities, in order for Wanda to tap into those branch realities, that series would have to happen post Loki.
Not necessarily, because even though the sacred timeline existed, it didn't mean they weren't able to access them through magic. Like he was like, remember, time isn't linear, right? So, and this again, this is where it gets confusing, and no one's going to understand this. But since time is not linear, all of that stuff that is happening, like it in the universe prior to when it's pruned, still happens within the sacred timeline, and that timeline still exists. It's just when that event happens that gets pruned, now anything that would have happened during that branch isn't going to happen anymore. So Wanda would still be able to access the multiverse. Doctor Strange would be able to go through the multiverse because there are other universes within the sacred timeline. It's not just one timeline.
They just occur up to a point until they're pruned.
Yeah, and now that branch, specifically that whatever was going to happen after that instance, that doesn't happen now. But
Okay.
everything else is still going. Because if you remember, in Loki, he saw all those other like variants of like Lokis that look completely different than our Loki. And like they eventually get pruned, but they were adults. So
Mhm.
them existing all up through adulthood wasn't like their existence wasn't what got pruned. It was something that happened way later on that inevitably got them pruned. Just like all the Lokis that were pruned in the void with them, right? There
Yeah.
was only one kid Loki. But all those other Lokis were adult Lokis. Some looked like Tom Hiddleston, some didn't. So their universe existed and still exists. It's just at some point that Loki went to do something and that got pruned. So the universe is still going on, just like our MCU, right? Loki, the one that we were watching in the Loki series, he existed in our timeline, and our timeline still went on. Loki just got pruned because he wasn't supposed to grab the Tesseract, but
Mhm.
he did grab the Tesseract, so he got pruned. So whatever events would have occurred had he not got pruned, they didn't occur, obviously, because he was pruned. But the
Sure.
MCU 616 still happened. Like
Mhm.
those events of Endgame still happened, even though he got pruned.
Yeah.
So like that's the explanation for all that, really. So the multiverse is still there. even though the sacred timeline exists, sacred timeline is essentially just a wheel that is constructed to prune anything that would eventually allow Kang to conquer that timeline. That's the
Mhm.
base reasoning behind it, because that's the only thing that really explains like why he's keeping the sacred timeline going and why he's pruning everything. It's like, well, I have to because my variants keep causing destruction throughout the multiverse. So I'm creating this so that all these events that you're going to see play out in Kang Dynasty don't happen. That's why I
Yeah.
was doing it.
They really need to come up with better terminology then, because pruning, anybody that's ever had to trim a bush or a tree or something, pruning means to literally cut off the branch.
No,
Like
but
you
exactly.
take it off completely and you stop it there at that point.
Exactly.
Um,
But the bush is still there.
but the bush is still there. But it actually, what they're doing is they're removing an aspect. It would be like taking a piece of bark off of a
Yeah.
a limb that's growing, not pruning it, not cutting it off and stopping it all right there. You're simply removing one aspect, one piece of that branch
Mhm.
in order to make sure that the branch grows a certain direction. It grows a certain way. It doesn't actually come. It doesn't grow to where they would lead to a king.
Mhm. That's the
So
one thing.
it's a little it's semantics, but in my head when I hear pruning, I'm like, oh, that means that they cut it off right there. That timeline just stopped right there. But that's not necessarily the case as far as
It
you're
was
laying it
that
out.
branch. It was that branch.
Mhm.
It was like it's pruning that branch, because you have to look at it like it's going around in a circle, and Loki grabs a tesseract. Now, because he grabbed the tesseract, that's different than what's going around in the circle. That's different than this multiverse's like sacred timeline path. So, him grabbing that, now there's a new branch. Timeline's still going on. We got to cut that
Does that
branch.
branch then become a circle, or does that branch become a
No,
straight line?
that's what you see branching off and doing its thing. But then there are other things that happen along that line. So like Loki can grab the Tesseract, and now there's a whole new deviation. Now a
Yeah.
whole new chain of events can occur. And there's not really a predetermined path for it, but different things happen because that timeline infinitely loops. There's not it started and it stopped, right? It infinitely loops. So at one point, Loki grabs a Tesseract and then he goes and gets a cheeseburger. But then as it keeps going, he didn't get a cheeseburger, he got a hot dog. So now you got two more branches. Like,
Sure.
and that's how, and then you prune that one. We don't want that one, prune that one. That's what the Sacred Timeline did. Is just, okay, in 616, Loki does not grab Tesseract. We don't want that branch. Boom. We're not doing that branch. And then time 616 still goes on.
So the
They
branch.
beat Thanos.
So you've got your one where Loki buys his hamburger and you don't want him to have the hamburger, so you prune it, and then that branch grows a different way. A new branch comes off because he doesn't get the hamburger, he gets, like you said, the hot dog or something. So then there's still a branch coming out of that timeline. It's just not the one that they didn't want. It
Yeah.
goes off. Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah,
And
okay.
that and they didn't explain it well, but there is the evidence does support that, because you have the other Lokis, you have people accessing the multiverse. So it's all possible. There's different versions of Loki there. So we saw 616. Even in Loki, the show, it was dubbed 616. So there were multiverses. So there were multiple timelines within the sacred timeline. But the sacred timeline wasn't one thing, and time isn't linear. And they did not explain it good, but it's the only way any of this works, and that's the basic multiple worlds theory in quantum physics anyway, in quantum mechanics. So you have to kind of I'm basing it off of that and what they said and what they've shown. So it has to work that way for it to make any sort of sense. So, not that I'm going to hate whatever they end up doing if it's not this stuff, but again, I just thought this stuff works so well. I'd be hard pressed that they're not doing something very similar to this, if not exactly. But yeah, do you got any other thoughts? That's pretty much.
No,
I think I did
I
it.
like it. I like it. I mean, if it plays out that way, that's a very rational and reasonable explanation for how things played out. I think they're doing a good job, especially now, of laying the kind of groundwork and foundation, getting people used to the idea of a multiverse. If you're going to make that the crux of how you bring such a big franchise back, yeah, you need to make sure people are on board with it. So yeah,
Right. And they do have to do a better job of explaining it, but I just have to assume that they will at some point. I mean, we have Loki season 2 coming up, which explicitly is all about that. I mean, we haven't really gotten I think that's why a lot of people might be like lost and think it's directionless, because it doesn't seem that way to me now, because I just made up all this new headcanon and it just works so well that I don't know, it just fits for me. So like I don't
yeah,
really feel lost at all. I just feel like they're more than likely going on this sort of path. That's
yeah,
really like the only way it can kind of connect. They could do some different things here and there, but despite the fact, even if you took the fact that everything I said makes you just tie everything up in a neat bow, it also, like, I think the coolest thing is that it really opens the door for things they could do with the X-Men stuff and the things that didn't exist. It's like, it'd be really cool for them to be able to go back and, like, tell all these different stories where they were there the whole time. Like, you could have them interacting with Steve Rogers and, like, doing whatever they want. Like, you could just literally tell this story about, prior to, during the events of Falcon and Winter Soldier, or during the events of Captain America, the Winter Soldier. Like, you could just introduce a story in that era, but now tell it with the lens of you have X-Men characters there. And it
yeah,
all fits because that's how the timeline is and was supposed to be and like is now. And, it's just put back into place and now we get to see it. And I think that would be cool. I don't know if they'll do that, but it opens the door for them to do that kind of stuff. So I think that's
yeah,
cool. I'll
yep.
probably have to edit this down in like a really cohesive way so people can get the bullet points like real easy, because it's really is like it's full on tinfoil hat. But once you understand it, I feel like it just makes sense. Would you agree
Yeah.
with that? Like, does it make
Oh
sense?
yeah,
Did I explain it good enough?
oh yeah, no, definitely, yep,
Good.
fully on board.
Good. Then I'm not crazy and
I'm
I
gonna go
didn't
make
just
I'm go make myself a tinfoil hat now.
okay, that's probably what helped, in all honesty. Funnily enough, I came up with that bit after I did this, so I managed to do all this without the tinfoil hat, but next time I'll have the tinfoil hat, so it'll probably be a lot better.
Oh yeah,
So, nevertheless, John, it was a pleasure talking to you about this stuff, and
yeah, it's
I'm
great.
glad that, you questioned it and you made me add some some answers I didn't even think of, like the multiverse traveling stuff. Like, they didn't you're right, they didn't really explain how that was what we always talked about with Loki, really. I think that's what it was, is that they never explained whether or not there's just one timeline. It's implied there's not if you look for it, like I said, with all the Lokis and stuff, and they never explained what the multiverse was in comparison to what the TVA does with timelines. But the only way in order to really make it make sense is that it's all the same thing. It's just they didn't use good verbiage and actually explain it yet,
Yeah.
you know? But nevertheless, what do you got going on? You wanna sign off here? You guys where can everybody follow you at?
You can go check out Nightwing_J over on Twitter. I don't know, I throw dumb stuff up there all the time. Um, that's about it right now. I've got a YouTube fixing fandom that I dabble in. I hate to even send people there because it's very hit or miss my updates on it. So, but yeah, hopefully I'll be back here some, and I'll catch everybody around.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely plan I obviously too. We did the podcast for about a year straight every week, and then we took literally like a year off. So it was funny because so I've been absent from YouTube for about a year, but I'd like to regularly come back and at least do like a video once a week. And I'd like to just have just this kind of thing happen more often, where we just hop on like the Batgirl news the other day. You sent me that, and it was actually the first I even saw it. I didn't see anything in the trades yet. So then I was reading it, and I was like, "Oh, no one was home. Like, it was just me here." So I was like, "I might as well just go make a video about this real quick and at least
Sure.
get my thoughts out there." And like, so I just did. So I'm hoping just to at least be able to do stuff like that and like this here and there. Just throw a couple
De-
videos up every once in a while and move on.
Definitely.
So, But that was
Sounds
it
good.
again. Yep, it was a pleasure having you on, John. You can
Thank
follow
you.
me at Sir Rob Bifo. Go and follow John at Nightwing_J, or is it K? Either or. I think he has a
Either
channel
or.
for both. Yeah, so either or. And then don't forget to like, subscribe, do all that fun stuff, and I'll see you in the next video.